my mind, there are essentially two, if you like, cadres, two teams of experts. One team are the tech experts. Now, tech obviously moving at pace. So what we're seeing with the using drone attacks, my understanding, by the way, is that each individual drone was personally manned as well, just in case of jamming intercepts. But nevertheless, that technology was not around, obviously, when I was operating. But that's the nature of tech, and we rely, us intelligence officers, we rely on the experts to keep us informed on what is the latest technology that's available, what are the latest gadgets or whatever it is. So that's one cadre, and the other cadre would have been the operational officers, the intelligence officers, who are actually involved with what I find the really interesting aspect of Operation Spiderweb, as it's called, to smuggle the drones in and get them couriered, allegedly or seemingly blindly by the drivers, to the individual statics sites near the airbase, the furthest thing, I believe, 4,000 miles from Kyiv, so or 4,000 kilometers. So that aspect of it was classic espionage. The infiltration of a hostile location. So simply, first of all, getting over the border, and getting this kit, which is not lightweight kit. This is, cumbersome stuff, and very visible, very obvious what it is. Smuggling that in, via covert infiltration, as I say, into certain locations from where they can then be dispersed, spread across, Russia, the biggest country in the world by landmass. This is a massive, massive operation, within which, in terms of that infiltration, that smuggling across the border, that's within a war zone as well, lest we forget. So, this isn't an easy operating environment at the best of times, let alone, trying to do something as covert as this. I would be doing whatever made sense, and that this is the key, or one of the key things of being an intelligence officer, is there's no static fixed rule book about what one does. One has to look at the operating environment, the circumstances. One has to use ingenuity, creativity, whatever applies. Now, I would well imagine, again, speculation, but I would well imagine that probably a variety of different tactics were used. There were over, I believe, over 100 drones that were taken across the border into Russia. So we could be looking at 100 different tactics per drone. So yes, it could be playing off border guards, although that comes, of course, with the risk of compromise, somebody changing their mind and blabbing, and then the whole operation is scuppered. So with that in mind, it's more likely to be done completely under the radar, in terms of getting stuff over the border. But one of the considerations within that is operational security at all times. So the spies involved, and this is a purely spy-driven operation. This isn't military, not even special forces. This is SBU intelligence, thoroughbred intelligence activity. The operational security side of that means, for example, that spies then tell even Ukrainian forces, or certain senior high-ranking generals or whatever that's going on, because again, they do not want to risk any leaks and any potential compromise to the operation. So this would have been done in complete figurative darkness, essentially, and probably literal darkness as well in some cases, to do that. To your question, in terms of tactics, it will be including things like just classic, on foot, or perhaps in vehicles, just sneaking over the border in areas that are perhaps less, less watched, less visible, all the rest of it. The easiest access points one can find, but again, difficult within a war zone. But nevertheless, that's just trying to get stuff over the border and then getting it to a position within Russia, that position, potentially being sort of 10, 15, 20 miles inland, from where they think, okay, it's now safe to actually transport more conventionally. But again, a raft, and it's possible they could have been, the drones could have been taken in by air as well, parachuted in, you name it. Even, I don't believe there's been any commentary about this, but even from the northern sea border as well, bring them in via that mechanism. But the commanders, the intelligence officers involved in this at high level, they would have been very open-minded about how to get these drones into the country. But again, they would have also been very concerned that all it takes is just one of them to be discovered for the whole thing to unravel. I think it's highly likely there would have been in-country Russians involved in the operation. The question, of course, is what knowledge did they have? To your scenario about, moving bombs and such like that, very often you are paying somebody to do something. You can allude to the fact that, look, I don't want this coming to the attention of the cops. Give the suggestion it's something a little bit criminal. So can you, is a nice juicy sort of backhander for the whole thing, but not go into detail. Certainly not reveal that this is a covert espionage operation. So that is very feasible. It is also feasible that Ukraine intelligence officers were using Russian agents who were fully conscious to what was actually happening. Again, that would have been a very sensitive aspect of the operation because of the risk of again, compromise.
SBU isn't the main agency, though they do have some. So the SBU is like internal security, and of course these are Ukrainian lands. But in general, the SBU is about anti-collaborator activity. Speaking generally, psychological operations, and in some regions, the SBU plays more of a role than in other regions, particularly in those regions that are partially occupied, let's say like Zaporizhia or Kherson. In general, though, and we have to be careful here because some of this is the Ukrainian state secret, so we don't want to get in any trouble with our Ukrainian friends. But in general, it's the special forces, so the SSO, who are responsible for kind of coordinating, but different agencies. So Bogdanov's agency, which is her, and the SBU, and I think even the Foreign Intelligence Service, they all have some sort of connection. It's quite organic the way it's grown up, and in traditional Ukrainian style, it's very messy and very hard to describe in a nice kind of organogram way. I would be surprised if they hadn't played at least some role. But there we would be moving into underground Ukrainian fighters who are active inside Russia, and there's quite an interesting distinction. Because you have some who are just, Ukrainian partisans inside Russia, right? Sort of by the book. But you also have a real growing tendency of Ukrainian partisan groups, or indeed Ukrainians in the Ukrainian, like in Free Ukraine, just paying random Russians to do certain things, very similar to what we see Russia doing in Europe. So, we keep on seeing this outsourcing where they'll pay like random people, maybe lure them in, they know they need a bit of money, etc. And then they'll try and bomb a shopping center or, some warehouses. Essentially, Ukraine does exactly the same thing, because I can say as a specialist in Russia, there are many problems with researching Russia. But one of the best things about researching Russia is absolutely everything is for sale. Data, people, or almost everything is for sale. And so the Ukrainians are making great use of that. And mainly coordinates, to be honest, that's the most use. I mean, these people are very valuable. Nobody wants to risk their lives, by doing silly kind of art protests. That's not, nobody I've spoken to, officially is very interested in kind of doing stuff that Instagrams well, but is ultimately not very helpful. The main thing is coordinates, to know where people are, and to be able to make sure that they're hitting the right people, because obviously the Ukrainians don't want to hit their own people, for obvious reasons. So the main issue is coordinates, being aware, helping to take down, for example, electronic warfare stations that are stopping Ukrainian drones, helping, to dismantle Russian equipment on that side, providing a lot of intelligence about coming Russian offensives, because they have to take certain roads, they have to use certain railways. So of course you could check on. So a lot of it's intelligence, I guess, similar to the way that the French resistance helped with knowing where the German defenses were ahead of D-Day, like that sort of information, targeting. But beyond that, kind of direct military element, there is a broader psychological war at place. This idea of the role of the resistance is also psychological, is what I'm trying to say. So they want to make sure that people don't give up hope. So the population of the occupied territories doesn't become like the population of Russia, where they just have just completely apathetic, just do not take any responsibility for themselves or have any agency. I think it's about just keeping hope, not false hope, like, oh, you're going to be liberated. You just wait, we'll liberate you soon, because everybody knows that's not going to happen, unfortunately. And I very much hope I'm proven wrong on that, but let's be realistic. But that doesn't mean it won't happen ever. I mean, I'm currently in Tallinn, and how many people said to Estonians, oh, well, you'll never be free. You just need to, the occupation's there now. And eventually they were, but it took a long time.
I don't think I know enough adjectives to describe this in the superlative sense that is necessary. But look, this is not the first thing we've seen of extraordinary Ukrainian reach into Russia. They took out those two generals months apart in Moscow. They've taken out Russian war criminals, whether they were pilots or captains of ships, deep in Russian territory. And then, of course, they completely surprised the Russians at great strategic cost with their offensive in 2022, as well as their offensive in Kursk last August. And they've shown, again, extraordinary ingenuity in chasing the Russian Black Sea Fleet into the far eastern corner of the Black Sea, out of Crimea, with simply naval drones. So Ukrainian ingenuity has been a regular feature of this war, not to mention the fact that they not only surprised Putin, but they surprised the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus by stymieing the Russian big invasion. Ukraine did not collapse in a week or two, as the U.S. intelligence agency predicted. On the contrary. This is the flip side of something the entire world has been talking about since Ukraine emerged as an independent country, which is the fact that the Russians have had great success in planting agents in Ukrainian intelligence agencies and co-opting those agencies, which is, many people explain, the Russian success in Donetsk and the Russian success in Kherson after the big invasion began, in Donetsk at the start of their war in the east of Ukraine in 2014, on them having co-opted the Ukrainian intelligence services. But clearly that intimacy is cut in both directions. And Ukrainians were both a great victim of the Soviet system, but parts of the Ukrainian elite were junior partners. So which gave Ukrainian great insight, better insight than we have, into how the Soviet Union operated and how Russia still operates. And, there was a great story in the New York Times, maybe in 2 winters ago, about how our intel services cooperated with the Ukrainians from the start of the war in 2014, and how impressed our intel guys were with what the Ukrainians could do. And that's absolutely right. I mean, I go to Ukraine even now after the big invasion several times a year, and I get top-rate briefings on what's going on in Russia from them. We know that Western and especially Americans' intelligence has been critical to Ukraine since the big invasion began. We also know, in the typical Biden timid fashion, we were slow to provide real-time intelligence. It took many, many months after the big invasion before that began to happen. And we know that the real-time intelligence which Biden established, I couldn't tell you precisely when, in the big invasion, has continued under President Trump, except for his shameful decision to suspend such cooperation for about 10 days. So this has been a factor in the war overall. But I suspect that the Ukrainians did not tell the administration about this operation. I suspect, therefore, they did not receive real-time intelligence that made this operation possible. It may well be that their knowledge about, what was at the Bielaya Air Base near Irkutsk came from U.S. intelligence at some point in the not too distant past. It's also possible their own substantial intelligence services had this information. I believe that the whole issue of Ukraine not informing the Trump administration or the claim that the United States provided the intel was a Kremlin propaganda meme designed to try and salvage something from this major strategic defeat that Zelensky and his intel folks inflicted on them, and also amplified by credulous people in Trump world, especially in the media, who also have no clue that Russia considers us, the United States, its principal adversary, and Russia's war on Ukraine is also a strike against American prestige and American power. Look, I didn't predict what they did. When I saw it, I was pleased. I won't tell you I was surprised. I was impressed for very obvious reasons. So they're just extremely inventive. But the point is this. They go after high-value targets, and they've been very good at it. I was in Ukraine when the Ukrainians began. It could have been 23. I'm sorry. Time is so compressed. Anyway, when the Ukrainians began their drone strikes on Russian energy installations, and to its shame, the Biden administration told them to stop it. And to their credit, the Ukrainians didn't listen to the timid souls in the White House. And we know that within 2 or 3 months of that campaign, they had taken out over 10% of Russian gas installations. So, there's that same ingenuity using technology, which had been fine-tuned, as all of society contributed to the development of the drones. So again, what they do next, I'm just not sure. But I'm waiting with anticipation.